So, after finally spending half a year reading multiple different Charles Manson oriented books, I am finally making a few videos reviewing these books I've read. So, the first book I'm going to review is the first one I read, Child of Satan, Child of God, of course, by Susan Atkins. Overall, I would give it a 3 out of 5. First and foremost, as always, this review is an opinion, and my opinion alone. If you feel differently, that's up to you, and I'm not here to change what anybody thinks or make them feel the way I do. This is a review, not a summary, and I will talk about points that will be spoilers if someone has not read the book. I had first heard of Susan Atkins' book when I started down the Charles Manson rabbit hole. I had wanted to read it for a while, though it wasn't until this year, 2021, that I was finally able to do so. Not because of things going on in my life, but honestly, the book is hard to start. Chapter 1 starts in the middle of a scene like that of an action or drama movie. If this book were some type of film, the beginning to the whole story would make for an interesting intro, but when it comes to reading the book, I found that it was a rather hard to follow and non-interesting start. I started on chapter 1 multiple times during 2021 and just could not get into it. In an ironic sort of way, reading the book out loud while recording myself made the read easier than just reading it myself. I understand why the intro was written the way it was, to seem different and put you right into the moment, but for me it fell flat. Actually, reading the beginning was brutal. I can't describe it any other way. Because of this intro, I feel like this part of the book was not written by Susan, but instead her co-writer, Bob Slosser. Or, on the other hand, perhaps Susan did write the first chapter and Bob wrote the rest. But I do believe that Susan wrote the majority of the book and the first chapter was not by her. The chapters about her childhood were actually quite interesting, though I do believe she lied about certain areas and twisted the story a little. For example, when she saw a cross burning down the street and then went to tell her dad, it just didn't seem possible to me. I wish that Susan talked more about her childhood overall, as there are things left out which were only brought up in parole hearings afterwards. In her, what I believe to be 1993, maybe 1990, parole hearing, she stated that she was molested as a child. Some sources have brought up how she was raped by her father and older brother, and friends from both of them. If this were true, why didn't she bring this up in her book? I feel like this would have been vital information to know and see her as a more sympathetic character, since she had an extremely rough start to life. Her quote-unquote second book, that was published posthumously, stated that her family would not help her and would only give housing to her little brother. When she had a child out of wedlock, they disowned her. If this were all true, why not bring it up in the book back then? I wonder if there was information omitted because Slosser decided to do so, or perhaps Susan herself didn't find it important. Susan had stated in her book that her parents were alcoholics, which is a rather well-known fact when a person starts to read about her. Once again, I wish that she would have delved more into this. As a reader, I would have liked to know and understand how bad it really was. Even when her mother passed away and all the chores came down to her, I felt like she didn't adequately convey how much her father mistreated her. Though I know she had a rough start to her life, I wish she would have said that herself. The few examples provided didn't really sell it to me. What I found most alarming was actually her anger from a young age. I think that if a person read this book when it first came out, which would have been before all of the information of her rough childhood was available, they probably would have thought that she was just a brat. I felt like the multiple times she described yelling at her pillow was a symptom of her having been abused and mistreated. I found it alarming because even at a young age, she was starting to show symptoms of a disorder that could have, and did, turn into a serious problem at her adult age. One of the best scenes Susan described in the book was when the children came to sing Christmas carols for her dying mother. It's a scene that I felt was easy to imagine, and it was very touching. As the book progressed, I found myself wondering why she didn't bring up certain facts that we had heard before. I wonder if this is due to her feeling like it was unnecessary, since people already knew certain things from Bugliosi's Helter Skelter. Perhaps it would have seemed like repeating the same thing. To me, I feel like it would have been nice to have certain things corroborated. In the first half of the book, there were these odd dreams and surreal situations that I doubt were even real. Her dreaming about the locked doors and waking up in a sweat seemed too much like a movie to me. Maybe it happened. I don't feel like it was real. What is odd is how these just stop occurring in the book when she joins the Manson group. I wonder if these were added in because of Bob Slosser to make the book more interesting. What I found interesting on top of that is how Susan described Charlie coming into her life in a way that was obviously predatory. You could tell that he was scoping out broken people to collect, which is what he did. The same type of tactic was used with Diane Lake, where, in her story, the girls had told Diane that they wanted to meet her for a while, despite her not knowing any of them. Even through this, it does not justify any of Susan's actions, and you can still see her trying to shift the blame on someone else. At her young age, she was angry, violent, and disturbed, yet she did nothing to change it all. She fell into drugs and alcohol and sold her body way before even becoming a part of the Manson family. Personally, I don't believe her stories on how she was first introduced to drugs like LSD and weed. They just seemed too convenient. I found it pretty alarming, though, that after Susan tried LSD for the first time, as described in her book, she woke up the next day naked, and the man with her was gone. The first thing I thought of was she raped? I wonder if this is something that ever even alarmed her. Susan portrayed herself in a much better light than she was in reality. For some reason, she tried to act like she was some country peach hunky-dory gingham girl from the mid-century. Throughout the book, she would omit the worst of her behavior, only mentioning it later in passing. One example of this is much later in the book, where she acted like a nice girl on death row, and then later she mentions how she used to be nasty and vulgar and swore all the time. These constant omissions of her real behavior only makes her story less credible and even harder to believe. For me, I don't care if you are a mean, nasty person. In fact, that's actually expected for a person that was on death row. I think it is for this reason that many people in the past have suspected this book as a ploy to show her good behavior and potentially get her out of prison one day, which, of course, never happened. I honestly can believe this, since a lot of the truth was scrubbed to make her look good. One thing I don't think Susan realized at all is that the book still made her look bad. I truly believe Susan Atkins had some sort of borderline personality disorder and maybe even antisocial personality disorder. She was a disturbed individual who cared about nobody but herself. People with these disorders tend to make rash decisions and are manipulative only to gain something for themselves and do not think about the well-being of others. This is most definitely seen when she was pregnant in the book and admitted to still taking drugs. The fact that she stated that Charles Manson of all people, told her to tone it down, and she brushed him off, does not make her look good. It's surprising that her son ever survived at all, let alone living life in squalid manners as a preemie. After Susan described the birth of her son, she mentioned in passing that she stayed at the fountain with him for a little while afterwards. This is something that I wish she delved into more, because there is very, very little literature on the fountain at all, and few members of the family have talked about it. In fact, I believe that Diane Lake's book has the most information about the Manson family's interaction with them, but even that is still a snippet. Now, keep in mind, at the time of this video, I have still not read every single book out there. There's so many. But when it comes to the major books and the books I've read on my channel, none of these say a lot about the fountain. So I would have liked, for Susan to have talked about it. Off the top of my head, only Susan, Paul, and Diane's books mention the fountain. I don't believe Tex talked about it at all, at least not in his first book. And I'm pretty sure Bugliosi didn't say anything about that at all either. And I say that because I read Helter Skelter before reading Diane Lake's book, and so when I read Diane's book, I was like, oh, whoa, I've never heard of this place before, So anyway, I think it's interesting, though, how almost all literature glosses over the fact that people like Tex and Susan were drug addicts. I guess when juxtaposed to mass murder, it's a small detail, but it's important to me that people like them were doing every drug under the sun. Susan admitted to taking drugs that I had never even heard of before reading this book. Maybe it's just because I'm generations younger than she was, but I was like, I've never even heard of, I think STP, But then again, that's a drug I don't think anybody uses anymore either, And granted, I don't know what people called it in the 70s, but I was pretty surprised that she actually admitted to taking meth. Granted, I can't remember the exact word in the book at the moment, but, it was a more technical, elegant term. But, I mean, she did meth, too. She did everything, So, I'm actually surprised that she admitted to that part and didn't cover it up. And her body was absolutely haggard after the abuse she did to it. And I was absolutely shocked when, near the end of the book, she said that the doctors in prison told her she needed a hysterectomy after all the STDs she had had. And at that point in her life, she was only 21. I mean, could you imagine? Like, I can't imagine. That's devastating, to have been told, like, oh yeah, you've messed around too much, you need a hysterectomy. You're not even 25. That's shocking, And so she says in her book that she ruined her teeth and her insides and even her mind with all the abuse she put herself through. To think about how bad a person would have to treat themselves at such a young age is unfathomable to me. But that also goes to show how bad she was into drugs and how many times she sold her body. And I don't know whatever happened with that. That's just one of those things that later literature and her second book never talks about. So technically we don't know if Susan ever had to get the hysterectomy. We don't know if Susan ever did get the hysterectomy. We don't know if Susan, had all of her teeth pulled, which I'm pretty sure she did, because in that same parole hearing from like 1990, you can kind of tell that her teeth are false. If you haven't seen somebody with dentures, you probably wouldn't know. But, I have people in my life that have dentures, and you can tell that the way the teeth don't really move in alignment with their jaw, it kind of just goes to show, like, oh, okay, those are fake, So I know that's like a super tiny random fact, but it is something I wanted to know, even in later literature. Susan mentioned needing a hysterectomy. Susan mentioned that the doctors are like, you need all your teeth pulled out. And then you hear nothing about that. For me, I'm like, so did it happen? Did she get all that taken out before she died? I don't know. And thinking about it now, it's kind of weird how when this book came out, she was already halfway through her life. Susan's descriptions of the Tate murders were disrespectful at best. She showed how impersonal and detached from the situation she was, even almost a decade after the murders. When she referred to people as the Tate woman or the Folger woman, she never gave these people their names, never associating them with their humanity. She was so detached from the whole murder, court, and prison situation that she seriously believed that she could get out of jail. The fact that there was a part in the book where she imagined having her own house and a white fence and a husband was just so out of touch, And while I was reading that part of the book, I was like, oh my God, I guarantee James Whitehouse read that book and was like, oh yeah, I'll be her husband. I'll be her husband, Couldn't help but cringe when I thought of that. But anyway, how could a person, a real and compassionate human being, ever believe that they could be free after all of that destruction they had done? Susan once again showed that she only cared for herself. The idea is made even worse when you find out that she sold her story about the murders to the press multiple times during the trial, and yet didn't bring that up in her book. Once again, omitting information to make herself look better, which even further supports the point of, oh no, this book was only created to make her look good and get parole, in her mind, which of course never did. Some people believe that Susan's religious conversion is true. Honestly, seriously, personally, I don't. I don't believe it. You know, what made me roll my eyes was how she truly believed she could speak in tongues, when that is something that would typically take people years to do in her religion. Many people would call her a jailhouse convert, and I think that they were right. It seems all too weird that she decided to fall into religion after falling in love with Bruce Davis, which that in itself shows how quick she was to latch onto a guy, even if he was on death row. Too. They were both on death row. How can you think about love? Susan brings up the veracity of her religion later in the book, where people in the prison stated that they believed she was a true believer. I just personally cannot believe it myself. Because she came off as one of those religious converts who just have to tell the world. Because of her religious upbringing, she might have believed in God. But I don't feel like her conversion in prison was for the enrichment of her soul as much as it was for the enrichment of her parole. Though I do have to admit that Susan didn't seem as show-offy like Tex Watson, who reeked of the whole "Jesus forgave me, why can't you?" in his book, the first one. I do think it's sad how Susan didn't realize she didn't have to sell her body until she was on death row. If it weren't for a little feminism from Carleen Faith, Susan might not have ever understood the depravity of her childhood. Granted, truthfully, I don't know if she really ever did. Ironically, Susan lived longer incarcerated than she would have free. With the way her life was going, I honestly, truly believe she would have been dead before the age of 40 from drugs and disease if she got to stay on the streets. I really do. In some sort of weird way, I could see that if Susan never went to prison for murder or anything like that, she very well have pretty much died in middle age, which she still did. But in a weird way, she probably would have been, these huge drug addicts. And if she didn't die from all the drugs, she probably would have been one of those post-druggy Jesus freak converts, just like she did in prison. But the whole age and lifespan thing is something I do want to talk about later. The whole ironic part of all these people in prison to this day is that you have people like Bobby Beausoleil in his 70s. I mean, all of them. Bobby Beausoleil, Patricia Krenwinkel, Leslie Van Houten. They're still alive to this day in their 70s. Charles Manson lived to the age of 83 in prison. All of these people have lived to old age in prison. And yet, the people they killed didn't. I think that's the ironic part of our justice system, where people like even Susan Atkins, even though she died in her 60s, well, she lived longer than Sharon Tate. I think that's the most ironic part of it all to me. Overall, the book seems to have done more harm than good for Susan when it first came out. Or even still now to this day, it doesn't do her any good. Despite it supposedly being a bestseller, Susan never made any money off of it. The money was supposed to be used to create a non-profit organization, which never happened. So what happened to the money? Did Bob Slosser run off with it? There are rumors online that Susan had $14 million or so, give or take, in a bank somewhere, and that she would have used that if she ever got out on parole. I have no idea how true that is. if it is true, kind of makes you think, oh, is that why James Whitehouse married her? Granted, I believe that dude totally was in love with her for real. But anyway, the fact, though, is that the money didn't go anywhere. And it didn't do anything good for her. Which, to me, almost made it sound kind of like money laundering. A few years after the book came out, Susan got married to Donald Lee Lazier. For reasons unknown to me, she decided to go to the press about it. I have never understood why. Because if she was the pious religious woman she claimed she was, why does she always have to go and literally be on a show? What is even more interesting is how supposedly she had talked to Donald Lee Lazier for years. And one source said that, she had they knew each other back in like 1968. And yet, he was never mentioned in her book once. Susan Atkins was definitely an attention-starved individual who didn't care if she was noticed for the terrible things she did. I think the book is interesting to see things through her mind and to try to understand her mentality during this point in her life. With the exception of chapter 1, it's not hard to read through, though it still leaves certain questions unanswered. Truthfully, I don't think this would be a bad book to read second in line to something like Helter Skelter or Jeff Gein's book.